Hi, I'm Brian Cox with Future Vision Research. In this video, I'll show you how to build the VCF SoCal 2025 Learn to Solder badge. Let's get right into it. So what you see here is everything that comes in your kit with the VCF SoCal badge. And let's go over these items first. We have the printed circuit board. We have an alcohol prep, 2 color flashy LEDs, battery holder, 2 15 ohm resistors, slide switch, a CR1220 battery, 3 clothespins, and I'm sure you're wondering what in the world those are for. Show you in just a moment. And then a stainless steel key ring. This will be used to loop through the hole so you can attach the badge to whatever you'd like to attach it to. Now, the order that we'll install the devices, we'll do the 2 resistors first and actually solder them one at a time. And then we'll do the 2 LEDs. And then we will turn the board over, do the slide switch, and then wrap up with the battery holder itself. Once we've tested everything and trimmed all the leads, then we'll install the battery. And then by testing, I mean once we look over all of our solder connections, really. And then we'll do the battery last. Now, let's get things set up. These 3 clothespins actually work as a very good circuit board holder. You never want to hold circuit boards while you're soldering them, right? Things are getting way too hot. The first thing we need to do is prepare our circuit board, and it's best to always clean up printed circuit boards with an alcohol swab before you do any soldering. So we're going to take the alcohol prep, which does come with the board, and clean the front and the back of the board. Sometimes there could be dust, I found, or residue from the manufacturing process, so it's best to give them a good cleaning. But don't use any other solvent besides alcohol. Other kinds of solvent might clean off the silk screen that we have, the nice color silk. So now that the prep is cleaned up, we have the board ready to go. We need to set up our board with the 3 clothespins. We're going to place the clothespins in an arrangement that will help stabilize the board while we solder. We're just going to place it somewhere where they'll be nice and stable, and we might rearrange these as we go. We're ready for our first part. Let's install the resistors first. I'm going to start with one of the 2 resistors. Here I can use a lead form tool, and the spacing between the 2 holes where the resistor will go actually works out good with this form tool for the top slot. So by pressing down on both sides, I've bent the resistor leads down so that they can be inserted right into the tree trunk, so to speak, where the spot is for the resistor. Now, resistors are not polarized. Ideally, we place resistors so that we could read the color code of the resistor the same direction that we would read the color code or the resistance value printed on the board. But since this is hidden by the tree trunk, we're not really paying attention to that, but I do recommend putting both resistors the same direction just for aesthetics, really. So we'll start with this resistor spot right here. We're going to place the resistor so that it goes all the way down flush onto the board like this. And while it's sitting flush, reach around to the other side and then gently splay the leads away from each other like this. You don't want to fold them flat, but you want to bend them away so that it will actually hold the part in while you are actually soldering it. And sometimes you might give the lead a little bit of a help just to make sure it's sitting flush as we're going. So here we go. This is the part ready to solder. Let me arrange these clothespins a little bit differently. And I think that I'll bring it up right around here and we're ready to solder. Now, the big secret with soldering is we're not actually feeding the solder onto the soldering iron itself. Instead, we're using the soldering iron to actually heat up the pad, which is the circular part, and then the actual lead. By heating those up so that they're hot enough to use solder, or to melt solder, I should say, then we actually make a good wetted connection. Wetted is the term when the solder is joined to the electronic part and the pad. So this is the process. Let me describe the process and then I'll show it to you. In order to solder, we're going to bring in the iron and then press it gently against the pad and the lead. We'll then feed the solder in. The solder is going to cover the entire pad and slightly climb up the lead. I'll take the solder away and then I'll take the iron away, and that will be a joined connection. So here we go. So I'm going to feed in just enough solder so that it joins over the entire pad. And I'll hold the iron here for a moment, and that's it. And that is the completed solder connection, just like that. So we can see that the solder flowed all the way around. I'm making sure it's in focus for you here. And then the solder is also slightly climbing up the lead. Now you'll notice a little bit of smoke coming up. That's the flux from the rosin core solder actually just evaporating away. But you'll also notice a little bit of an appearance of a gel on the board. Now I'm using rosin core solder, but I'm using no clean rosin core solder. So technically this kind of flux, which is the material inside the solder down the core that actually helps ensure a clean solder connection, that could technically stay on the board. You don't have to clean it off. But if you want to, it should come off with a soft brush and isopropyl alcohol. Or of course they make flux remover. Now, between solder joints, I am going to be using a brass sponge in order to wipe off the iron. It's important to keep your iron clean. If your iron is blackened, let me zoom out just a little bit. If your iron is blackened, like you see down here, where it hasn't been treated, then it's not going to carry heat. You want your tip to be nice and shiny. Okay, let's do the other side of the resistor. So I'll bring it nice and close so you can see what's happening. And I think that's still in focus. I'll bring in the iron. So I'm bringing the iron. I'm heating up the pad and the lead. I'll now feed in some solder. And notice I'm keeping the iron still, but I move the solder around so that I coat the entire pad and let it slightly climb the lead. I'll take the solder away and then the iron, and we're good to go. So there's one part completed. Okay, before we do the other resistor, let's talk about trimming leads. Now we need to cut the leads off of the board so that they won't cause any short circuits. And we definitely need all of our leads trimmed before we actually apply the battery to it. And by the way, you can see it's good to double check before you trim the leads. Make sure that your resistor is still sitting flush. If your resistor was pushed up on one side, one thing you can do, usually with the help of somebody else, is one person can hold the board, and then you could heat up the pad from one side and gently use a pair of pliers to pull the lead short while you're keeping the solder hot. But again, never do that with your fingers because everything's going to be way too hot to do. In order to cut these leads, we're going to use diagonal cutters. These are also called flush cutters, but we are not cutting it flush. When you trim the leads, you want to make sure that you trim the lead above the solder joint. In other words, a little bit of the lead should be sticking through, and it's good to hold a finger out over the lead when you trim it so that it doesn't launch it across the room. And there we go. That is one component soldered and ready to go. Okay, now when we do this next resistor, I'm going to show you another trick that we could apply while we're doing the soldering. But let's get the part ready to go. This will be the other resistor. And first, let me show you another method for installing the resistor as far as bending the leads. I could hold it up against the part where the two holes are available to insert the part. And instead of using the lead form tool, I'm going to just hold my needle nose pliers right up against here. And this is a pretty tight bend on the resistor. And then I'll push that down. I'll push down one lead, and then I'm going to hold it up against, or really put it into the hole. So that I can see how my bend is doing. Okay, that's looking pretty even. And so then I'll go ahead and hold the other side. Now avoid bending the leads with the pliers and avoid bending back and forth. If you ever played with a paper clip, you know you can only do a couple of bends before you'll fatigue the metal and the part could break off. So I'm going to hold it here and then I'll just press down. Now both leads are bent down and we'll see how my spacing is. Now I'm going to make sure that my color code is the same direction for aesthetics. So I'm going to have the gold stripe down on both resistors. And so let's see how this goes. Make sure that I'm doing this on camera so you can see it. Okay. And there we have it. The resistor is sitting flush against the board. So same thing, I'm pressing on the resistor to keep it against the board, and then I'm gently splaying the leads away from each other to hold it in place. And now I'll get my clothespins ready to go, and we'll solder this connection. Now I mentioned I was going to show you another additional soldering trick when you're creating a connection. With a little bit of practice, what you can do is set the iron on top of the tip of the solder, and that will help you start the connection. Remember, it's all about transferring heat from the iron onto the pad and onto the lead. So if you bring your solder just right here, and then you set your iron on top of it, you'll melt a tiny little bit of solder that will help carry some more heat, and then you can feed the remaining solder needed for the connection. And so again, I've fed solder, I removed the solder, and I've taken the iron away. And then there's that, whoops, let's keep it on camera. There's that connection ready to go. And now we'll go ahead and do this last connection. Same thing, I'll show you this example. I'm holding the tip of the solder right here, and I'm going to just set the iron right on top, and that helps me heat up the joint much faster. I'll feed some solder and then take the solder away and then the iron away, and we're done. Couple other things to remember you want to avoid. Remember to remove the solder first. If you take the iron away first while the solder is here, your joint will cool, and then your entire thing of solder will be stuck to that joint. So you want to be sure to take the solder away and then the iron. Okay. Now, something else to point out, with these circuit boards, the pads actually go all the way through. So in other words, we have the metal circle of the pad here, and then it's actually metal through the circuit board like a little tunnel to the other side. So ideally, some solder will come through and actually start to form on the other side. But what this means is you do want to definitely practice how much solder you're feeding. If you're feeding lots and lots of solder and you can't figure out why the joint isn't getting bigger, that's because the solder is flowing through and then collecting as a big ball on the other side. And we don't want that to happen. If there's too much on the other side, it could cause a short with one of the other connections. So here's our two resistors ready to go. And you notice that this resistor is a little bit sideways, and sometimes you can give it just a little nudge to help it straighten out. But as long as we are flush against the board, then those are looking good. Let's trim these two leads. And so remember the same thing. I'm going to put it so that there's a little bit of the lead sticking out above the solder joint, and then I will trim that. With both resistors ready to go, it's time to do the LEDs. Now the LEDs, we have two of them and they are the same. So it doesn't matter which goes in which of the two sets of holes, but we do need to pay attention to polarity. LEDs, or light emitting diodes, are a polarized part. That means they care very much about positive and negative. The way the board's designed, the square pad here, that is for the negative connection, and then short on the LED, that is negative. So the round pad will receive the long lead. Let's go ahead and place this on the outside palm tree here. And I'm doing the outside so that the board will balance a little bit better when we use the clothespins to turn it over. So now to double check this, with the LED sitting flush, we'll notice that the long lead has the pad with the positive marking, and then the short lead again, of course, is the square pad. If the LED is in backwards, it will not light up. So I'm going to go ahead and splay the leads away from each other while I'm holding the LED in so that it sits flat. And then I will go ahead and use another 2 clothespins, I think, for 2 sides of a triangle here to keep this sitting flush. So same thing, let's install that LED. And don't forget, again, make sure that the long lead is in the circle pad, also marked with the plus. Same thing here. I'm going to hold the iron in, feed the solder. And then I'm just holding the iron for a moment to see how the solder settles. And I'll take the solder away and then the iron away. And there's the connection, just like that. Let's do the other side. Now I'll show you the trick again, tapping the solder for a moment and then feeding the rest. And I'm going to hold the solder, or the iron, I should say, for a moment. let the solder settle, and then there's that connection as well. So for each connection, we are looking for, again, that solder to flow over the entire pad on the circuit board and then slightly up the lead. If you have a big ball of solder, that means you fed too much, and ideally you want to remove it using a solder sucker tool or desoldering braid. But we definitely want to make sure that there's no connection between these two pads. If you see a connection between the two pads, that means there's a short, and you'll definitely need to remove that solder. By the way, notice when I fed the solder and when I held the iron, I kept the iron tip on the side of a pad, never in the middle. Avoid putting the iron between two pads. That could cause it to carry solder across, which would lead to a bridge. A bridge is a short circuit. Okay, and we'll go ahead and trim the leads as we go along. I find it's useful, especially when you're getting started, to trim leads as you go. That way they're out of your way. But I'm doing the same thing. I'm just trimming it so that a little bit of the lead sticks up out of the solder. Okay, and let's do the other LED. So same issue with polarity. The long lead goes into the circle, and then the short lead goes into the square pad. And then double checking from this side, the long lead is in the circle pad, which also has the plus sign. And I'm holding it flush with my finger here, and then I'll gently bend the leads away from each other, trying to bend it so that it will hold it in tight to make sure the LED doesn't wobble. Okay, and I think that's going to be pretty stable. I'm tapping it here to see if it's going to give when I hold the iron in. Let's see if it wobbles or not. A big thing with soldering is you want to be sure that the joint stays fixed. If it's wobbling around, then that could create a bad connection and won't carry as much heat. So there is the solder, and then I took the iron away, and it did bounce a little bit, but I'm satisfied that I was holding the board still while I fed the solder. And I think what I'll do is use my third clip right over there to somewhat balance this out a little bit. Okay, and can you see that? Yep. Let's feed that solder. Holding the iron for a moment, and that's it. Now, if you notice that your solder seems to collect in a ball on the lead, but it's not actually touching the pad, that is a prime example of what's called a cold solder joint, where the pad was not heated enough. So what you want to do is reheat the pad. So to fix a cold solder joint, in other words, where the pad or the lead was not hot enough for the solder to melt, bring the iron in, and don't forget to gently press in. It should be sitting against the board. Let everything heat up more, and then the solder most of the time will flow properly then to make a good connection. Okay, there's the other LED ready to go. So let's trim these leads. And I'm holding my finger up. Looks like my cutters are magnetized because they're holding up all the other leads. And that brings up a good point. Be sure to double check your circuit board to make sure you don't have any trimmings like this stuck against your board. If you have a trimming like that, then that will cause another bad connection. Okay, and one of the things I'm going to check here is just make sure that I have leads short enough so that they won't touch any other connection. So I'm going to shorten that one just a little bit, but still I'm not cutting the solder, only cutting the lead itself. Well, we're done with the front of the board. We have our two LEDs and we have our two resistors. Up next is going to be the slide switch. So we're going to turn the board over. The slide switch actually installs from the back of the board, and we're going to install it matching the silhouette from the silk screen here so that the knob of the switch faces out. Now, this switch is designed to hold itself in place. We'll still need to solder it, but what we want to do is line up all 5 pins and then gently rock. You might need to rock back and forth and set it so that the switch is flush like this. So that's how the switch should look. And while you're here, you might just turn it off because we want the moment of truth where we install the battery and then turn the switch on. But make sure that the switch is sitting flush like this. And then we'll turn the board over to the other side and we're going to solder from this side. So let's turn this around. And I find that with the switch, the board pretty much sits stable, so there's no need really to use any of the clothespins for this situation. When you solder the switch, what you want to do is solder the two outside connections and then double check to make sure the switch is indeed flush, and then we'll solder the three middle connections. Now, don't let these connections intimidate you. They are definitely smaller, but you now are an expert solderer, having done 2 resistors and 2 LEDs. And as long as you follow the process, then you'll be good. The big trick with soldering apart where leads are close to each other is holding the iron from one side and then feeding from the other, never putting the iron between 2 parts. So if you notice here, now as I use the iron, I'm noticing a little bit of a wobble. So I'm rethinking my clothespins. Let's try it with clothespins. Remember, the switch is clipped into place, so we don't have to rest the board on the switch. Let's try this. If I put these really close, but not in the way, that should make a more stable connection, or a stable, I guess, location for me. So then I put the other clothespin over here. There we have it, nice and stable. Okay. So we're going to, again, and by the way, I'm using a chisel tip. The nice thing with the chisel tipped iron is it's a little bit flat, so I can rest that flat side against the board. So notice I'm pressing against the board, and then I'm pressing against the lead, or the little nub lead from the switch. And I'm just going to touch the solder to the iron. And now I'm going to feed onto the switch pin itself and the pad, and take the solder away, take the iron away, and there we go. That's a soldered connection. So now I'm going to do the opposite side of the switch. Same thing, I'm going to just touch the iron, and then I'll feed a little bit more. I'm holding the iron for a moment. Keep in mind, it may take a moment before the solder will melt, because you're actually heating up not only the lead, but the outer metal case. And so it could take a little bit longer to get hot enough, which is another reminder, avoid touching this switch for a few minutes after you solder it, because it could be hot enough to burn you just by using the iron. Now, by the way, let's take a look here. Let me zoom out. Is my switch still flush? And yes, it is. So since it's still flush, then we are good to go. We can zoom back in here, and then let's do those 3 middle connections. So here's 1 connection, holding the iron for a moment, 2 connections. And now this, I'm noticing the solder balled up just a little bit, so I'm going to hold this in place for a moment longer to allow that solder to settle. Okay, and that tells me is I'm feeding a little bit too much solder. So with this one, I'm just going to give it just a little tap of solder, and then that connection is looking better. I'm not going to need to redo this middle one, but it is a little bit more solder than is really necessary, which is why it balled up on top of that. So I hold this out like this, try to get it in focus for you. But I'm satisfied with those connections for this. All 5 of these switch connections are made. We're down to our last part. And our last part is the battery holder. Now, the battery holder is a surface mount part. That means there are no leads that go through the board. But it does have 2 little registration pins. And those 2 registration pins will go into those 2 holes. And then, of course, we're going to match the shape of the battery holder to the shape on the silk screen here. So I'm going to take my battery holder, slide it in here, and then notice that we have the metal tab here and here. Something very good to do is to use the clothespin and use the little indent from the switch into the portion of the clothespin so it somewhat fits inside. Make sure that the clothespin is allowing the battery holder to sit flush. And then I'm just going to arrange this so that the leads, the little tabs, are sitting as close to the middle of the pads on the board that I can. So I'm satisfied. Yeah, I'm satisfied with that. Okay, let's do, so the clothespin is kind of spring loading it a little bit. Let's see what I can do here. Okay, there it is. So let me find a comfortable place to get at this. Now, when you solder these, what you're going to do is put the iron so that you're going to rest it on top of the tab from the battery holder, and then it will also heat up the pad on the board. This is another good example where it's useful to rest the iron on top of a little tab of solder. And so I'm just going to hold this in place to heat it up. And now I'm going to feed the solder onto the tab, and the solder should be hot enough, or excuse me, I should say the tab from the battery holder is hot enough to melt the solder. The pad from the circuit board is also melting the solder. I'll now take this away, and there you go. That's what that connection should look like. The solder is flowing over the whole pad and over the tab from the battery holder. Now that one connection is soldered, you can take the clothespin out from the middle, but I'll still put it here so that I have a stable location. And then let's do this connection. Same thing, I'm going to rest the iron right on top, but now I'm going to lift it up, rest it right on top of a little bit of solder to help carry heat. And now I'll feed more solder, take the solder away, take the iron away, and there we have it. That connection is done as well. Now, let's look over our board before we attach the battery. We're looking over the board. We're double checking to make sure that there is no solder between pads that would cause a bridge. That would be a short circuit. We're making sure that all of our leads are trimmed and that no trimmed lead pieces are sitting on our circuit board. We want our power switch off. And of course, on the front, our two resistors are sitting flush and our two LEDs are sitting flush. Now, before we install the battery, a quick note about cleaning your board. I did use no clean rosin core solder. What that means is I technically don't have to remove the flux from the back of the board before I power it up. But a best practice is to clean the flux off of your circuit board. To clean no clean flux or regular rosin core flux, you can use isopropyl alcohol and a soft brush like a toothbrush to clean off and scrub off the flux from the back. Be sure that the board is completely dry before you apply a battery. Another option is organic flux solder, which is water soluble, but you absolutely have to remove water soluble flux before you apply any power to it, because that flux is actually a little bit conductive. In order to clean water soluble flux, you're going to use hot water and a soft toothbrush. But again, you must make sure that the board is completely dry before you apply power. And we're ready for the battery. So again, this uses a CR1220 battery, and the negative side of the battery goes towards the printed circuit board. What that means also then is that the side with writing on the battery will be facing you or facing up. So here's the battery. And again, with the side facing up, what you want to do is install the battery so that you put it in the bottom side and then just press it in and it will click into place. By the way, when you're ready to change the battery out, all you have to do is hit this little release on the bottom. Just pull back on that and then the battery will pop out. Okay, so we'll take that in here. Again, the writing side up or plus side up, press that in, and then we'll turn it over, and then let's turn on this power switch. And there we have it, a working VCF SoCal 2025 Learn to Solder badge. So congratulations on finishing your badge. One last thing to do, you want to take the little stainless steel keyring, and let's make sure we have it the right direction. Insert one side through, and then you can see that they're threaded. So then you can just thread this in on itself, and that will allow you to attach it to whatever you like. So thank you very much for watching this video. Please visit fvresearch.com for more Learn to Solder kits. Thank you.